What happens when two beloved television personalities clash so intensely that one storms off set in the middle of a live interview? Today, we're diving into the shocking confrontation between Kelly Clarkson and Howie Mandel that left audiences stunned and the entertainment world buzzing. This isn't your typical celebrity interview gone wrong. This is a full-blown verbal battle that escalated so quickly. Neither host nor guest seemed prepared for what unfolded. Make sure to subscribe and drop a comment below, because you won't believe how this all went down. It started as what seemed like a routine appearance on the Kelly Clarkson show. Kelly had welcomed Howie Mandel to promote his latest comedy tour, and the conversation began pleasantly enough with light banter about his career and recent projects. The studio audience was relaxed. Kelly was her usual bubbly self, and Howie appeared comfortable in his chair, cracking jokes and sharing anecdotes about life on the road. But then Kelly shifted gears in a way that caught everyone off guard. She leaned forward with that knowing smile she gets when she's about to ask the question everyone's thinking, but no one wants to voice. "Howie, I have to ask you about something that's been making headlines lately," Kelly began. Her tone still friendly, but with an edge that wasn't there moments before. "There's been a lot of talk about your comments regarding mental health awareness and how you've handled discussions about anxiety and obsessive-compulsive disorder in the media." Howie's expression immediately changed. The easygoing comedian who had been joking just seconds earlier suddenly looked guarded, his shoulders tensing as he shifted in his seat. "Kelly, I'm not sure what you're referring to specifically," Howie replied, his voice carrying a defensive undertone. "I've always been open about my struggles, and I think I've helped a lot of people by being honest about what I deal with." Kelly wasn't backing down. She pulled out a tablet and glanced at it briefly before looking back at her guest. "Well, there have been some critics who say that your approach sometimes makes light of serious mental health issues, that you use your conditions as material rather than genuinely advocating for awareness." The studio fell noticeably quieter. This wasn't the direction anyone expected the interview to take, least of all Howie, whose face was now showing clear signs of irritation. "That's completely unfair and frankly insulting," Howie shot back, his voice rising slightly. "I've been dealing with these issues long before it was trendy to talk about mental health. I've used my platform to help people understand that they're not alone. And if humor is part of how I cope and how I help others cope, then I make no apologies for that." Kelly nodded but pressed forward, clearly not satisfied with his response. "I understand that, and I respect your openness, but don't you think there's a difference between sharing your story and potentially trivializing the experiences of others who might not have your platform or your resources to deal with these challenges?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Howie's jaw clenched, and for a moment, the only sound in the studio was the subtle hum of the cameras and lighting equipment. The audience seemed to collectively hold their breath, sensing that something significant was happening, but not quite sure what. "Trivializing," Howie repeated, his voice now clearly strained with anger. "Kelly, with all due respect, I don't think you understand what you're talking about. I've spent decades of my life struggling with these issues, often in silence, often without help. And when I finally found the courage to speak about them publicly, it was to help others, not to trivialize anything." Kelly's expression hardened slightly. She wasn't backing down from this line of questioning despite the obvious tension building between them. "I'm not questioning your struggles, Howie. I'm questioning whether your approach always serves the community you claim to represent." That was the moment everything changed. Howie's face flushed red and his hands, which had been resting calmly on the arm of his chair, now gripped the fabric tightly. "Claim to represent?" he said, his voice now loud enough that it echoed slightly in the studio. "I don't claim to represent anyone. I represent myself and my own experience. And if that helps other people, great. If it doesn't meet your standards of advocacy, Kelly, then maybe you should stick to singing and leave the mental health discussions to people who actually live with these conditions every day." The audience audibly gasped. This wasn't playful banter anymore. This was a direct attack, and Kelly's face showed she felt the sting of his words. Her usual warm demeanor vanished, replaced by something much colder and more determined. "That's an interesting perspective coming from someone who profits off comedy specials about his anxiety," Kelly fired back, her voice steady, but with an unmistakable sharpness. "I'm just asking whether you've ever considered the responsibility that comes with that platform." Howie stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward from the force of his movement. The camera stayed focused on him as he pointed a finger in Kelly's direction. "Responsibility?" Howie's voice boomed across the studio, His fingers still pointed accusingly at Kelly. You want to talk about responsibility? Let me tell you about responsibility, Kelly. Responsibility is waking up every morning with a mind that won't stop racing with thoughts that spiral into places you don't want to go, and still finding a way to make people laugh, to make them feel less alone in their own struggles. Kelly remained seated, but her posture had straightened, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She wasn't intimidated easily, and her years of experience handling difficult interviews were showing. That's exactly my point, Howie. You just described something incredibly serious, something that millions of people deal with, and yet your comedy specials turn those exact struggles into punchlines. Punchlines. Howie's voice cracked with emotion and anger. Those aren't punchlines, those are survival mechanisms. Do you have any idea what it's like to live inside a mind that tells you everything is contaminated, that everyone you touch might make you sick, that every doorknob could be your doom? I turn that into comedy because the alternative is to let it destroy me completely. The studio audience was completely silent now, caught between fascination and discomfort as they witnessed this raw, unfiltered exchange between two people they thought they knew from television. This wasn't scripted banter. This was real emotion, real conflict, and everyone could feel it. Kelly leaned forward in her chair, her voice taking on a more intense tone. I'm not diminishing your personal experience, Howie. But when you go on stage and get laughs by acting out compulsive behaviors, when you make jokes about panic attacks, don't you see how that might send the wrong message to people who are suffering in silence? Wrong message. Howie threw his hands up in exasperation. The wrong message, Kelly? Before I started talking about this stuff openly, nobody was talking about it at all. At least now people know they're not alone. They know that someone else understands what they're going through, even if that understanding comes wrapped in humor. Kelly shook her head firmly. But that's just it, Howie. Your version of understanding comes from a place of privilege. You have money. You have access to the best therapists. You have a career that accommodates your needs. What about the person working 2 minimum wage jobs who can't afford therapy? Who watches your special and thinks their anxiety should be funny too? The question hit Howie like a physical blow. His face went from red with anger to pale with something that looked almost like shock. For a moment, he seemed genuinely speechless, processing what Kelly had just said. He started, then stopped, running a hand through his hair. That's not fair, Kelly. That's not fair at all. You're twisting everything I've tried to do to help people into something selfish and harmful. I'm not twisting anything, Kelly replied, her voice gaining strength as she pressed her advantage. I'm asking you to consider the impact of your choices. When you make light of mental health struggles for entertainment, you're not just sharing your story. You're shaping how society views these issues. Howie began pacing behind his chair, his agitation clearly escalating. You know what, Kelly? I've been doing this for decades. I've received thousands of messages from people telling me that my openness helped them seek treatment, helped them realize they weren't crazy, helped them understand their own minds better. But somehow your opinion, based on what, a few critical articles, is supposed to invalidate all of that. Kelly's eyes flashed with something between anger and determination. My opinion is based on talking to mental health professionals who see the real-world impact of how these issues are portrayed in media. It's based on understanding that representation matters, and that when someone with your platform presents mental health struggles as comedic material, it can perpetuate stigma rather than reduce it. Perpetuate stigma? Howie's voice rose to almost a shout. I've done more to break down stigma around mental health than most people will do in their entire lives. I've put my personal struggles on display, made myself vulnerable in ways that most celebrities would never dare, all in the service of helping others feel less ashamed of their own minds. Kelly stood up now too, matching his energy. And I'm saying that maybe, just maybe, there are better ways to break down stigma than getting laughs from panic attacks and obsessive thoughts. Maybe true advocacy means treating these issues with the gravity they deserve. Gravity. Howie laughed, but it was a bitter, harsh sound. You want gravity, Kelly? Here's gravity. Some nights I can't sleep because my brain won't stop telling me that I'm contaminated, that I'm going to make someone else sick, that I'm fundamentally broken. Some days I can't touch my own family without having a complete meltdown about germs and contamination. That's gravity. And if I can take that darkness and turn it into something that makes people laugh while also making them understand, then that's not exploitation. That's alchemy. The raw honesty of his words seemed to give Kelly pause, but only for a moment. But don't you see, Howie? That's exactly what I'm talking about. What you just described is heartbreaking and serious, and it deserves to be treated with respect, not turned into material for a comedy special. Respect. Howie's voice was shaking now with a combination of rage and hurt. You think I don't respect my own struggles? You think making people laugh while educating them about mental health is disrespectful? Kelly, you have no idea what you're talking about. And frankly, it's offensive that you think you have the right to lecture me about how I should handle my own mental health journey. Kelly crossed her arms, her own voice now raised to match his intensity. I have the right to ask questions, Howie. Especially when your approach affects how millions of people understand mental health issues. This isn't just about you anymore when you put it on a public stage. Public stage. Howie's voice was now trembling with barely controlled fury. Kelly, everything about my life has been on a public stage since I was 20 years old. I didn't choose to have obsessive-compulsive disorder. I didn't choose to have anxiety. But I did choose to be honest about it instead of hiding behind some perfect public image like most people in this business do. Kelly's jaw tightened at the implication. Are you suggesting that I'm not being honest about my own struggles? Because I've been plenty open about my battles with depression and anxiety, but I don't turn them into entertainment. No, you turn them into feel-good television moments, Howie shot back, his tone dripping with sarcasm. You talk about them just enough to seem relatable, just enough to get the sympathy vote, but you don't actually live them out loud the way some of us do. You sanitize them for daytime television consumption. The accusation hung in the air like a lit fuse. Kelly's face went through a series of emotions, from shock to hurt to pure anger, all within the span of a few seconds. The studio audience was now completely still, as if afraid that any movement might break whatever spell was holding this confrontation together. How dare you, Kelly said, her voice low but filled with venom. How dare you minimize my experiences or suggest that I'm not genuine about my mental health struggles? Just because I don't make them into comedy material doesn't mean they're any less real, or that I'm any less committed to helping people. But that's exactly the problem, Howie continued, seemingly unable to stop himself now that he'd started down this path. You think there's only one right way to handle these issues, one acceptable way to discuss them, and anything that doesn't fit your narrow definition of appropriate advocacy is somehow wrong or harmful. Kelly took a step closer to where Howie was standing, her voice rising again. My narrow definition, Howie, my definition includes not making money off of other people's pain, not reducing complex mental health conditions to comedic bits, and not perpetuating the idea that mental illness should be entertainment for people who don't understand what it's really like. Other people's pain, Howie exploded. It's my pain, Kelly. It's my anxiety, my obsessive-compulsive disorder, my panic attacks that I'm talking about. I'm not exploiting anyone else's story. I'm sharing my own. And if that makes some people uncomfortable, then maybe they need to examine why they think mental health should only be discussed in hushed, serious tones. Kelly shook her head vigorously. It's not about being uncomfortable. It's about being responsible. When you have a platform like yours, when millions of people look up to you, you have an obligation to consider how your words and actions affect the broader conversation about mental health. Obligation. Howe's laugh was harsh and bitter. The only obligation I have is to be authentic to myself and my experience. I don't owe anyone a sanitized, politically correct version of my mental health journey just because it might make them feel better about their own prejudices. Kelly's voice rose to match his intensity. It's not about political correctness, Howie. It's about impact. It's about understanding that when you make mental health struggles into comedic material, you're contributing to a culture that doesn't take these issues seriously enough. Not seriously enough. Howie was pacing again, his movements sharp and agitated. Kelly, I've been advocating for mental health awareness since before it was trendy. Since before celebrities thought it was safe to talk about these things, I've put my career on the line, my reputation on the line, my personal relationships on the line, to be honest about what it's like to live with these conditions. And I'm saying that maybe honesty isn't enough, Kelly fired back. Maybe honesty without responsibility is actually harmful. Maybe making people laugh at mental illness, even your own, sends the message that these conditions aren't serious medical issues that deserve proper treatment and understanding. Howie stopped pacing abruptly and turned to face Kelly directly, his face flushed with anger and something that looked dangerously close to betrayal. You know what, Kelly? I thought you were different. I thought you actually understood what it meant to struggle with these issues. But you're just like everyone else who thinks they know better, who who thinks they have the right to police how other people cope with their own demons. I'm not policing anything, Kelly said, her voice steady despite the obvious tension. I'm asking you to consider whether your approach is helping or hurting the people you claim to be advocating for. Claim to be advocating for. Howie's voice cracked with emotion. There's that word again. You keep saying I claim to advocate like my decades of openness, my willingness to be vulnerable, my efforts to normalize these conversations are all just some kind of performance or publicity stunt. Kelly crossed her arms again, her posture defensive but determined. I'm saying that advocacy requires more than just being open about your own experiences. It requires thinking about the bigger picture, about how your actions affect the community you're supposedly trying to help. Supposedly trying to help, Howie repeated, his voice getting louder with each word. Kelly, I have helped people, real people with real struggles, who have told me directly that my openness, my humor, my willingness to make light of dark situations has literally saved their lives. But somehow that doesn't matter to you because it doesn't fit your idea of what proper mental health advocacy should look like. Kelly leaned forward, her voice intense. And what about the people who don't feel comfortable speaking up because they think their mental health struggles should be funny? What about the people who don't seek treatment because they think anxiety and obsessive-compulsive disorder are just quirky personality traits thanks to how they're portrayed in comedy? That's not on me, Howie said firmly. That's on a society that would rather laugh at mental illness than actually address it. And at least my approach gets people talking about it instead of pretending it doesn't exist. But it is on you when you contribute to that culture, Kelly insisted. When you have influence, when you have a voice, you can't just say whatever you want and then claim it's not your responsibility how people interpret or react to it. You know what, Kelly? Howie's voice was shaking with a mixture of rage and hurt that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. I've spent my entire adult life being judged by people who have no idea what it's like to live inside my head, and I thought, foolishly apparently, that someone like you, someone who has also struggled, would understand that we all cope differently. Kelly's expression softened slightly, but her resolve remained firm. Howie, I do understand that we cope differently, but that doesn't mean all coping mechanisms are equally helpful or harmless. When your coping mechanism becomes public entertainment, it affects more than just you. Public entertainment. Howie's voice rose to a near shout. My life isn't entertainment, Kelly. My struggles aren't entertainment. They're real. They're painful, and if I can transform that pain into something that brings light into the world, while also helping people understand these conditions better, then that's my choice to make. Kelly stood her ground, her voice remaining steady despite the emotional intensity of the moment. But it stops being just your choice when it influences how millions of people understand mental health. You can't separate your personal journey from your public impact when you're using that journey as material for your career. My career. Howie laughed bitterly, throwing his hands up in disbelief. Kelly, my career could have been just fine without ever mentioning my mental health struggles. I chose to be vulnerable. I chose to be honest. I chose to risk everything to help normalize these conversations. And this is what I get for it. Accusations that I'm somehow harming the very people I've spent decades trying to help. Kelly's voice took on an edge of frustration. No one is questioning your intentions, Howie. But intentions don't absolve you of impact. Good intentions don't automatically make harmful actions okay. Harmful actions. Howie's face went pale, then flushed red again as the full weight of her words hit him. You're calling my advocacy, my openness, my decades of trying to help people understand these conditions harmful actions. I'm calling into question whether making mental illness comedic is the kind of advocacy the community actually needs, Kelly replied firmly, whether it helps or whether it perpetuates stereotypes and minimizes serious medical conditions. Howie stared at her for a long moment, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he tried to process what was happening. You know what, Kelly? I've been in this business long enough to recognize when someone is trying to tear me down. And right now, that's exactly what you're doing. You're taking my life's work, my most vulnerable moments, my efforts to help people, and you're twisting them into something ugly. Kelly shook her head vigorously. I'm not trying to tear you down, Howie. I'm trying to have an honest conversation about responsibility and impact. If that feels like an attack, maybe you need to ask yourself why. Why? Howie's voice cracked with emotion. I'll tell you why, Kelly. Because I've spent 40 years being told that I'm too much, that I'm too anxious, that I'm too obsessive, that I need to tone it down, be normal, fit into everyone else's idea of acceptable. And when I finally found a way to be authentically myself while helping others, I get people like you telling me I'm doing it wrong." Kelly's expression showed a flicker of something, regret, maybe, but she pressed on. Being authentic doesn't mean being immune from criticism or from considering how your authenticity affects others. We all have to balance being true to ourselves with being responsible to our communities. "Responsible to our communities," Howie repeated, his voice hollow now. "Kelly, my community is people who live with anxiety, with obsessive-compulsive disorder, with mental health struggles that make every day a challenge. That's my community. And they've embraced what I do because it helps them feel less alone, less ashamed, less broken." Kelly leaned forward slightly, her voice intense. "But what about the members of that community who feel like their struggles are being minimized when they see them turned into comedy? What about their voices?" "Their voices," Howie's tone turned bitter. "Kelly, where were all these voices when I was struggling in silence for the first 20 years of my career? Where were they when no one was talking about these issues at all? At least now there's a conversation happening, even if it's not the perfect conversation that meets everyone's standards." Kelly's voice rose again. "The conversation doesn't have to be perfect, but it should be respectful. It should treat mental health with the seriousness it deserves, not as material for getting laughs." That was the moment something inside Howie seemed to break completely. His shoulders sagged, his face went through a series of emotions. And when he looked back up at Kelly, there was something different in his eyes. Not just anger anymore, but exhaustion, disappointment, and what looked like genuine pain. "You know what, Kelly?" he said quietly, his voice completely different from the shouting that had filled the studio moments before. "I came here today thinking I was going to have a fun conversation with someone I respected, someone I thought understood what it meant to struggle and to find ways to cope. Instead, I've been lectured, judged, and essentially told that my life's work is harmful." Kelly seemed to realize that something had shifted in the tone of their confrontation. "Howie, that's not what I'm saying." "No, Kelly, that's exactly what you're saying," Howie replied, his voice gaining strength but remaining eerily calm. "You're saying that my approach is wrong, that I'm hurting people instead of helping them, that my decades of advocacy are somehow misguided or selfish, and you know what? I don't have to sit here and listen to it." He walked over to where his chair had rolled after he stood up, but instead of sitting back down, he grabbed his jacket from the back of it. The studio fell completely silent as everyone realized what was happening. "Howie, wait," Kelly said, taking a step toward him. "We don't have to end it like this. We can have a respectful disagreement." Howie turned to look at her one last time, his expression a mixture of sadness and resignation. "Kelly, there's nothing respectful about what just happened here. You invited me on your show to promote my tour, and instead you ambushed me with criticism disguised as concern. That's not a respectful disagreement, that's a setup." "It wasn't a setup," Kelly protested. But Howie was already walking toward the edge of the stage area. "Maybe it wasn't intentional," he said over his shoulder. "But that's what it became. And I have too much respect for myself, and for the people I've tried to help over the years to sit here and be told that my efforts to normalize mental health conversations are somehow harmful." He paused at the edge of the set, turning back one final time. "Kelly, I hope you never have to experience the kind of judgment you just put me through when you're at your most vulnerable. And I hope the people watching this understand that there's more than one way to cope, more than one way to heal, and more than one way to help others do the same." With that, Howie Mandel walked off the set of The Kelly Clarkson Show, leaving behind a stunned host, a silent audience, and one of the most explosive celebrity confrontations in recent memory. The cameras kept rolling as Kelly stood alone on stage, clearly shaken by what had just transpired. What did you think of this intense confrontation between Kelly Clarkson and Howie Mandel? Do you think Kelly went too far with her line of questioning, or was she right to challenge Howie's approach to mental health advocacy? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and make sure to subscribe for more shocking celebrity moments that you won't see anywhere.